Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for giving me a chance to come and meet so many faculty who I admire and respect. Thank you for taking me out of New Jersey in late February. All of this is just a real joy to be here, so I really appreciate it. I wasn't sure what I would talk about today. I knew that it would be maybe an audience that was a little bit broader than a typical social psychology audience. And so I thought that I would challenge myself to step back and paint the broader picture of the issues that I've been thinking about in my career. And one of the ways in which I think that maybe my work could speak to the moment right now is that I think that we are in a moment where we're very concerned about the big forces that are influencing us. Religion, politics, political leaders, social media. And I'm here to tell you it's very true, they are influencing us. That's correct. But where I think maybe some of the work that I've been doing and certainly standing on the shoulders of many others, maybe where I could speak to these concerns is to talk about how these big forces influence us. I think that there are some underappreciated forces that are working to channel this influence, and they influence us in a particular way. These maybe underappreciated sort of second step influencers. And I think that once we can appreciate how they do this, this allows us to put our hands on the levers to try to change that influence, to try to modify it and direct it perhaps in a different way. So that's my broad argument. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a talk in 3 parts. So to try to make this case, first I'm going to just give you some intuition. I'm going to tell you stories. Some of them are from research, some of them are from my observations. In the second part, I'm going to try to put a bunch of data behind some of these intuitions and tell you about some work that we've been doing, some of which was just published this fall. And then in part 3, what I want to do is say, okay, now that we know this, how can we use it? And talk about some of the work that I've been doing that is more intervention focused and tries to channel what I'm calling these underappreciated influencers to try to leverage some of our good intentions in social psychology about improving human welfare. I'm going to talk a lot about violence because that is something that I have been working on quite a bit and working that is against violence. And but I'm going to try to talk about a lot of other different things, a lot of other different kinds of influences. I'm going to talk about the courts. I am going to talk about faith leaders. And yes, I'm sorry, but I must tell you, I will talk about Taylor Swift. I am contractually obligated to talk about her at this moment in time if I identify as a person studying influence. Okay, so will this advance? Let's try it this way. That's great. So part 1. I want to start with a serious story. This is a picture of a beautiful Rwanda. And Rwanda, as you might identify this country with the event of 1994 and the genocide, during which millions of ethnic Tutsis were killed, most often face-to-face and by people they know. And we think upwards of 75% of the entire Tutsi population was killed in that event by their Hutu neighbors and sometimes even family members, and motivated by the extremist Hutu leaders who were attempting to stay in power during a moment of great political crisis and transformation. This was the event that, as Human Rights Watch said, was one of the defining moments of the 20th century, because it was a time when we learned that we had not fundamentally transformed our global society after the Holocaust, that we had not fully learned those lessons. One other parallel with the Holocaust was the way in which media propaganda played a very large role. In Rwanda, because the main media outlet is, the medium is radio, I'm talking about specifically a hate radio station. I'm picturing the founder of this radio station called RTLM. And the quote that I have on the screen is a quote that the International Criminal Tribunal actually used in the prosecution of this media program following the genocide. And one thing that you might be interested to know is that this was a radio station that did not start out using screeds against ethnic Tutsi. It was actually an extremely popular radio station, very entertaining. It had the freshest DJs and the latest music. And even ethnic Tutsis would listen to this radio program because it was so engaging and entertaining. It did also include screeds about Hutu identity and stereotyping and racist jokes. But during the genocide, it actually directed people to kill in particular places and encouraged on the killing. And so, you know, including lines like, "But we must kill them all, let's finish the job." This is influence, right? And there are not that many types of influence where you can say that it was deemed so influential, it was convicted by a criminal tribunal, but this is a picture of the judges of the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, who decided, after taking into account all of the evidence, that without a firearm, machete, or any physical weapon, the radio caused the death of thousands of innocent civilians. The conclusion of this court was that the influence of this radio station was such that it was almost like a hypodermic needle. This is the type of theory that has been used in cases against media propagandists in the past, including from the Holocaust, with the idea that by broadcasting these messages, it infects our minds, it infects our hearts, and causes us to be part of violence. Now, I'm not coming here to tell you that I don't believe that the radio station should be held accountable. But one really important contribution that psychologists and behavioral scientists have in understanding this kind of media propaganda is that we think that there's much more to the story than this infection model. We believe that in order for these kinds of extremist media influencers to have an impact, that the people who are listening have to feel that this is a shared social reality. They must feel that there are others around who are both listening and understanding and believing. And so the question is, how do these programs establish this kind of shared reality? How are they channeled through these other people? And if you look and see what happens when people listen to a radio in Rwanda, it often looks something like this. There are people gathered around a radio, and people are listening together. And so the idea here is that the media influence for this propaganda station, and much of the influence I'm going to talk about today, is often channeled by the people around us. It's not so much a vertical influence as it is something that has been sparked and then channeled in a horizontal way by the people around us. The people listening to this radio are not just hearing the content, but they're looking at each other's faces. They're seeing how others are reacting. They're seeing endorsement or rejection or encouragement, right? So let me give you a little data as well as intuition here. Rwanda, as I said, is an immensely beautiful country. It's called the Land of a Thousand Hills. And a bunch of very clever economists actually have taken advantage of this fact to investigate the impact of the radio propaganda during the genocide, because there are features of the geography such that the radio broadcasts are being sent out from a specific location, and also because the political organization of the country is such that one community is one hill. What that means is that by arbitrary chance, different proportions of people during the genocide were receiving in any one community were receiving that radio signal. So maybe a majority of the population or some minority of the population were actually able to receive the radio signal. And so what they did was they used that population share of those who had access to the propaganda broadcast and plotted that against the population share of people who were participating in the violence as documented in the records following the genocide. And without getting too deeply into this study, what I want you to take away from this figure is that if we believed in a hypodermic needle of influence, we should just see that as more people got access to the broadcast, more people should have been committing violence. That's actually not what we see. And in particular, for this type of violence, the darkest line, which represents the most common type of violence during the genocide, which was collective-based violence. What we see here is that there's some sort of critical tipping point, that people were not participating in the violence until they really understood that the majority of people in their community were also listening to this program, right? Or that the other people were sharing in the same types of broadcasts, talking about where they should go and who they should kill, right? And so it's this idea of sharing in the reality of these broadcasts together and not simply hearing it and enacting its encouragements. Okay. I am talking about Rwanda in part because this is where I learned so much about this topic, and I think by it fairly honestly, I didn't go to Rwanda thinking that I would be studying the influence of people as much as I would be studying the influence of radio. So I started working in Rwanda 10 years after the genocide had ended, and I was there to investigate the impact of a very different kind of radio broadcast, one that was aimed at reconciliation and the organization of a different kind of political order, one that included dissent and one that included much more interethnic sharing and cooperation. And what I want to show you is something that happened over the course of my research. This radio show, like the propaganda show that I was telling you about, became immensely popular. I was studying it as I would a medical trial with a randomized control setup where some people were being exposed to this radio show and some were being exposed to a comparable radio show with different messages. One thing that I observed was as time went on, I'm about to show you a video that was taken after my study was done. The show got so popular that they started doing these live broadcasts, live reenactments of some of the scenes from this radio soap opera. And I was there at one of them, and I took a video, and I just wanted to show you what it looks like. I think many of us have had this experience as a member of an audience where not only are you watching what's going on in the show, but you're watching one another, right? And there's been some beautiful work done on this by game theorists talking about how so many of us organize our political rooms in horseshoes, so that not only are we trying to influence with our direct speech, but we're trying to influence so that we can watch how other people are reacting to the speech. And that's certainly what's happening in this setting. You see people turning to one another and talking as they watch the show progress. And so what are people reacting to, right? They're reacting to the actors, they're reacting to one another, and the reactions actually, what I will argue, channel the influence of the radio program itself. You may be thinking at this point, that's fine, Betsy, this is all very well and good for some cultures where media is still immensely social. That is not the case for us here in the United States now. We're watching our phones, we're very atomized, we're not necessarily influencing one another. I want to submit to you one other story here. Some of you may have heard about certain singers showing up at football games this past fall. And when Taylor Swift shows up at these football games to watch her boyfriend, people have been tracking the ways in which she influences game attendance and watching and jersey sales and so forth. And yes, this also is influence, and it seems quite like direct influence. But I want to show you something else that really caught my attention, and I think is a puzzling and always impressive thing about being a human, which is this. This is a video from TikTok. You can pull off many videos like this one, but here's one example. What are we doing? Why are we taking videos of one another cheering for Taylor Swift, one another watching Taylor Swift, right? And I want to say that what's so fundamentally human about this is that we are deeply interested in the reaction of audience members. That's why these kinds of videos go viral, is that we enjoy watching not just the show, but everyone else's reactions. And this is telling us something. This is telling us about Taylor Swift's influence, right? And so I've been mentioning the radio program that I was studying and saying, you know, I came by this topic quite honestly because I was investigating whether or not this radio program would influence people's ideas about interethnic cooperation, would influence their predilection for more dissent against authorities, more interethnic cooperation. And what I found was actually that many of the listeners of this radio program weren't necessarily moved personally to believe in these messages. That is, their personal attitudes didn't necessarily change. An example that I could use is that one message of this radio program, it was a Romeo and Juliet style show, and it was about interethnic marriage in part, and the benefits of interethnic marriage for peace. And so what people would say is, I don't believe that interethnic marriage brings peace. I, just witnessed a Hutu man kill his Tutsi wife. You're not going to convince me of this. However, I do believe that Rwandans now are starting to believe in this. Right? So this extremely popular show that was getting so much attention from other Rwandans that featured this interethnic marriage, the phrase that we heard many times and that was borne out in our survey data was that I really don't believe it, but I think other Rwandans do. I think this is the way the wind is blowing now. And the reason why this mattered to me was that we also saw behavior change as a result of exposure to this show. So in comparing the people who had been exposed to this reconciliation show to people who had been exposed to a women's health radio soap opera, we found that they were much more likely to collaborate with people who were from a different ethnicity and to behave in ways that were consistent with this impression of what other people thought, not necessarily what they themselves thought. And it's a story that I can believe, especially when it comes to violence. I don't believe that the mass participation in the Rwandan genocide means that it was a nation full of genocidal killers, right? And when people talk to us about the genocide in Rwanda, they talked about it. They used very poetic language, such as, when the violence came, it came like rain. It felt like this was the law. This is what everyone was doing. And so it really started me on this path of trying to understand not just the big influences, the ones that we convict in court, but also how they become effective and why, and who we pay attention to when we're trying to understand whether or not to pay attention to those big influences. Okay. So media, celebrity, government, religious institutions, yes. But what I'm going to argue for the rest of the talk is that their influence is channeled through our observations of everyday people. We're looking to others to make sense of these messages. Are these messages popular? Are they resonating? What do these messages mean? What does it mean for me? Okay. And all of these lessons that I was taking from the research that I was doing early in my career really reminded me of a phrase that I read as a graduate student from research done back in the 20s when Americans were studying the impact of radio, and that was our medium. And it was the phrase that media doesn't tell us what to think, it tells us what other people are thinking. Other people's reactions are telling us whether this is the new normal, right? And this got me thinking, and I'm not going to inject a ton of jargon into this talk. This got me thinking about social psychology's interest in norm perceptions. So not our correct understanding of what is the norm. Do we all actually believe in violence? But our perception that I'm thinking that people here support violence. And so this is what I've been studying really since that story and that study in Rwanda. We're very motivated as humans to understand what is typical, what is desirable in our communities. And so we're very motivated to find out what other people think of as normal. Okay. So let me put some more data behind this. I'm skimming over the top of lots of different stories and intuitions. But in part two, I'd like to talk about some research that we've been doing lately on a much different kind of big influence, and that's courts in the US. I'm going to take you back a few years, back to when the Supreme Court looked like this, with a few different people on it. And I want you to think back to the case of Obergefell v. Hodges, which you might remember as the case considering the legality of same-sex marriage. My graduate student, Margaret Tankard, and I were very interested in what kind of impact this decision would have. So prior to the decision, which was in 2015, adults in the United States had steadily been increasing in their approval of same-sex marriage. It looked like this. And of course, you know, if you split that out by Democrat and Republican, there were very differing levels of approval, but they were both on the rise. And so one thing that we wanted to know was, will the court's decision actually change people's minds? Will it result in an even higher spike of approval? Or will the court actually the court's decision imply something about what other people think? So the court, especially at that time, enjoyed the highest approval rating of any government institution in the US, and was thought of as an expert body and one that represented the citizenry. And so the idea was, maybe in making this decision, maybe the court would also be showing us the way about where the country was going, what way the wind was blowing. And so we were very interested to know whether our perceptions of norms might change as well, in addition to any attitudinal impact. So we studied the impact of this court decision with a very simple design. It's a time series design. We gathered a somewhat large group of people, over 1,000 people, and we gave them a very short survey, and we just kept doing that. We asked them about their personal opinion. To what extent do you oppose or support gay marriage? And then we asked them about their perceptions of the norms in this country. To what extent do you think Americans oppose or support gay marriage? Okay. And the logic of this design is we started doing that in March, knowing that the Supreme Court always announces on some arbitrary date in June. And so we intensified, these are the number of times that we asked about people's personal opinions and their perceived norms. We intensified the number of times we started the survey in June, hoping to catch just around the cut point when the Supreme Court would. So it was right here in the end. So we have some measurements both before and after the ruling. So Obergefell was announced on June 26th. Does anyone remember where they were on that day? Do you remember the announcement? Do you remember something like this? Do you remember something like this? I definitely remember where I was on that day. I remember tons of rainbows just blanketing my social media page. I definitely remember the very emotional coverage And I'm purposefully showing you it was coming from all points in the country. Here's the New York Times, here's the Kansas City Star, longtime partners rushing to the courthouse and getting married in front of cheering friends and families and strangers. I'm telling you this for a reason, and I'm going to come back to it. But there we are on the 26th. And this is what we found. Our ideas on that day, like literally overnight, our ideas about other Americans changed. These are every single, I'm just showing you all the data. This is every single respondent we had leading up to the decision. And this was the day after the decision and afterward. And the increase here means that people were more likely to say, or on average, people said that they believed that more Americans supported same-sex marriage the day after the announcement. Okay. I want to compare that. This is their personal attitudes. There is absolutely zero impact, like a beautiful straight line. Right? There's absolutely no impact on personal opinions. And what does this represent? To a public opinion researcher, this is really exciting news. So let me interpret the effect size for you. This is twice the size of the past 2 decades of change in boomers' attitudes toward same-sex marriage overnight. That's an enormous, enormous effect. Because this is the United States, let me show you this in terms of conservative and liberal. These are personal attitudes. Once again, you see there's very different levels of support among conservatives and among liberals, but no one is changed by the announcement. And compare that to the fact that both of them, and they actually agree quite a bit more on the level of support among all Americans. And they are both changed by the announcement of the court. They think that more Americans now support same-sex marriage. So we wrote the study up and talked about how norms, seem to be more flexible in our personal attitudes, and perhaps this is, a very special influence of a highly influential representative, more or less universally respected institution, right? That we might think about as representative of the United States. Maybe that's why we get our ideas about norms from them. But we always had in the back of our mind, maybe we were getting our ideas about norms from this, from watching people celebrate, right? But we had no real way in our data to get at this. Whether the influence would be coming from people celebrating the announcement or from the court itself. And so what we decided to do more recently is study a different decision, a decision that was going to go against the majority of opinion in the United States. This is Dobbs, but you know Dobbs as Roe, right? So what happens when the Supreme Court rules on something and we don't see lots of rainbows, right? How do we then think about Americans' norms and what Americans think about abortion? These are various headlines when Roe was struck down from all across the country. So once again, just like Obergefell, we had a lot of visibility on this decision. You might also remember that we learned about this decision twice. It was leaked in one of the most catastrophic government moves for my own research. We managed not to complain. There are other things to complain about. We did manage to salvage the data collection though, so I can show you what we found. My graduate student, Chelsea Clark, and I had actually been surveying one group of participants since 2020. So we could show how stable our opinions were of other Americans. And what I'm showing you here is that when the decision was leaked, interestingly, we now updated our opinion to think that other Americans were more supportive of abortion. So going against the leaked indication of the Supreme Court, and then once again, after the official ruling, staying pretty certain that more Americans actually supported abortion than we thought before. Okay? So this is an effect in the opposite direction as the same-sex marriage case. And this is just another way of looking at it, but it really shows that particularly for people who strongly agree that other Americans support abortion, this spikes right after a week. I'll show you one other way that we salvaged this data collection, which the leak really took us by surprise. We also collaborated with another group of people who had been measuring attitudes about abortion in the Supreme Court, and collaborating with them to follow up with that group after the leak. And then after the ruling, we found even more of an increase, and this is with a very large and representative sample of Americans saying that they believed that more Americans now support abortion. And this is what it looked like in our country, and not everywhere, but in many places after the court ruled. And so what we also attempted to, in this study to do was really try to parse this influence apart and say, well, do we have any evidence that people were paying attention to others after the court ruled in order to figure out what were the current norms with respect to abortion? So we looked to Twitter. These are absolutely bananas numbers. So I'm going to try to scale them for you again. So this is showing about 78 billion engagements with the topic of abortion in the days following the announcement. But that means everything. That means you saw something in your feed, you liked something, you retweeted everything. But to scale this is on the same scale as the attention that the insurrection at the Capitol received. So that's how much attention this drew. And when we did a sentiment analysis of these abortion tweets, we found that the majority of them were negative, were disapproving of and this is, regardless of what, political ideology or ideology bubble you were in, obviously that was going to vary. But then what we did was we looked specifically to see whether people were sharing information about the fact that even though this can change depending on how you ask it, the majority of polls at that time were showing that the majority of Americans believed that abortion should be legal, that there should be accessibility. And so we found all of the persistent links to any reports about this polling. And we looked to see how they were shared on Twitter. After the leak, they weren't shared. I mean, this is still quite a significant bump, but it pales in respect to the bump that it received here, being shared about 4 million times. And again, a sentiment analysis of those tweets showing that people were sharing this poll in a disapproving way, showing this is going against the majority of what Americans believe. Okay. So again, what I'm trying to argue here is that the court is obviously influential. We're all paying attention to the court. It's changing everybody's headlines on that day. But I'm trying to build a case here in that some of these big influences that we worry about are the triggers. And then the direct aftermath, what we do is we look around. And much like the audience at the radio soap opera performance I was showing you, we looked around to see, are we enjoying this? Is this what you think too, right? This is the sense making we do after these major events. And what we see really affects our perceptions of what's average, what's typical, what's desirable, our norm perceptions. Okay, so part 3. If we know this, why does it matter? I've been trying to make the case that I believe that norm perceptions go along with a behavior change, as I saw in Rwanda. But also then the question is, well, then how would you use this? How can you possibly control an audience reaction to an event? How could you somehow harness this in order to increase welfare? I'm going to try to summarize for you a few different attempts that we've been making in our lab. You can see. You can tell me how you think we're doing. The first example I want to talk about is violence in schools. Okay. I live in now and have lived for a while in New Jersey. And anyone who is from New Jersey might remember this tragic event of a Rutgers student who took his own life after being intimidated by a fellow classmate and bullied. And what happened in New Jersey after this event was that our governor, Chris Christie, passed a law requiring all schools to have anti-bullying programming. Didn't fund it, so that was really a challenge for the schools. But I was very interested in this because one of the things that I believe about young people in schools is similar to what I believe about Rwandans during the genocide, which is that I don't believe that young people in schools are all fundamentally bullies who are wielding, power and influence to hurt one another. I think there is something about a school's climate that tells them what is acceptable, what is a desirable way to try to dominate someone. And so I wanted to know, is there a way to change students' perceptions of what is normal and what's acceptable as a way to treat one another? So this took us into the realm of understanding how norms are passed through social networks. If you think about a social network, or actually, let me back up for a second. If you think about this event in which you look around and try to figure out how many people agree with this, how are we reacting to it? I bet it's not your intuition that, say a young person at school would just look around and try to figure out, well, what's the average behavior here? Let me just take an unweighted average of how everybody's acting, and that's what is expected of me at this school. No, we're all embedded in networks, and we look to particular people. We pay special attention to certain people. And my argument is that those are the people who will have this outsized influence on your perception of what is the norm. And so it became our goal to test this idea and to say, well, if you could somehow affect the behavior of the people with the most eyes on them, is that a shortcut to affecting people's ideas about what is normative at the school? So this is a school, if you don't recognize it. This is a network representation of every single person at a high school in Connecticut. And all of the circles represent a student. All of the ties in between them are what we call directed. And so this was a map that I made based on an event in which every single student sat down in the school at the same time and wrote down up to 10 people from the prompt, who did you choose to spend time with in the last 2 weeks, either face-to-face or online? So this is a network of attention. I didn't ask about their friendships. I asked about who are you motivated to pay attention to, okay? And you'll see that some of these circles are highlighted in yellow. And these yellow people are what Hannah Shepard and I called social reference. These are the people to whom you refer when you're trying to figure out what is normal at this school. And if I zoomed in on this graph, you might see some different configurations of people when you're finding a social reference. So here's a toy representation. You might have the widely known person who a lot of people look toward and pay attention to. So many, in fact, that not everyone knows one another. And then this is quite intuitive, but the clique leader, and that's a smaller group of people typically looking toward them, but they're all close. They all know one another. And one thing that's really interesting about doing this exercise is that it doesn't just turn up the so-called popular kids. These aren't just the classic opinion leaders of the school. They come from all corners of the network. This is I have to say, it was a very satisfying first way to do this kind of study because it was one school where we first tried out this method. And when we gathered in a room together, all of the social reference, it was a pretty magical moment where you see this social network come to life in front of you, and they looked at each other and said, how did you find this? They all knew one another. They weren't all friends for sure. And some of them were, sort of leaders of the chess club, and others were, captain of the football team, right? But they were all leaders in their own right. What we did in that study Let me tell you what we did before I get to this study. May I go back? Thank you. What we did in this study was we actually took a random sample of all of the leaders. We got them together and we took them through a program in which we asked them to try to make their school a better place. We didn't tell them exactly what to do. We talked to them about what would make them feel more comfortable coming to school. What were the things that really stressed them about their social relationships at school? And could they work on one issue, basically, to try to make their school a better place? We felt that in giving them the freedom to choose what kind of issue to work on, that might make it a more honest expression of what they actually wanted to change about their behavior at school. And then what we did was for the rest of the year, we waited and watched and took measurements of both everyone's attitudes and their perceived norms at the end of the school year, but also who was getting in trouble for peer conflict. We also surveyed teachers and asked them who was bullying who and so forth. And what we found was that if in the network you were more likely to be exposed to a randomly selected leader who had participated in this program, that you were less likely to be nominated by a teacher as someone who was abusing others, and that you were more likely to be nominated by other students as someone who was treating other people with kindness. Now, no, we're not talking about they were nominating the leaders. They were talking about people who had been affected by these leaders in the network. So this was sort of a proof of concept for us because no one's attitudes toward bullying changed. No one's attitude toward race or toward fatness or toward social class changed as a result of this intervention. But students did talk about the fact that these things were less tolerable at their school, that it was not cool to make a joke about someone's weight, or it was less cool to make a joke about someone's weight, and so forth. Okay, so we see this same split between the way that students described what was acceptable and what other people thought and what they personally thought. And it went along with their behavior. So what we did then was we decided to scale this up, and we did so now in New Jersey with 56 middle schools and about 24,000 students. And this is a social network map of each one of these schools. So in every single one of these schools at the beginning of the year, we did the same exercise. Everyone sat down and we identified the social reference. In this case, what we did was we asked, well, does it matter if you're a social referent or not? Could we do this with anyone? And so we knew who was getting the most attention paid to them. But in this instance, what we did was we did an arbitrary scoop of students at each school. And then we randomly assigned each school to either have our program or not. So we have a group of pure control schools. And then in the schools where we did our anti-violence and bullying intervention, we had a group of students who they didn't all get in the same room and say, how did you find us? They were a bit more of a random sample, right? So we have a group of students at all of these treatment schools, and we took them through, again, a kind of a campaign exercise. We asked them, what would you like to change about your school? And once we got them past comments about better food and, less homework, and got them into the topics of, how we treat each other more kindly, they decided on their own personal campaigns. Like, I wish that you could sit with, people of your choice at lunch, rather than having so much exclusion. I wish there were less anti-gay jokes and so forth. And again, what we did was we acted as their campaign managers and just asked them, whatever you do, whatever you decide to campaign on, just make sure your name is on it. We wanted to make sure that it was salient that they were doing this. And so some of them did hashtag campaigns, both online, but also in the school, and we asked them to sign their name to it, so that other students knew who was advocating for this. We allowed them to print out some of their slogans on the evergreen popular rubber wristbands that they loved passing out. And we tracked also who they passed it out to throughout the network. Finally, at the end of the year, again, what we found was that what shifted was your impression of what your peers thought about with respect to bullying and harassment. And this time we can compare people in the school who were not exposed at all to one of the treatment students in the group. And now these are the students, and their perceptions of norms are improving, meaning they are less likely to think that students in their school support bullying and harassment. But these are the people who were randomly exposed in the network to someone who wasn't a social referent, just a student with average number of connections. And finally, these are the people who were exposed to one of the social referents. So what I read from this is that this isn't a statistically significant difference. Anyone doing something is changing, you're updating your norm perception. But the people who really cause you to update your norm perception are those people who lots of people are motivated to do that, right? So there is something special about being one of these social reference. And then finally, what we do here in this figure is at the end of the year in all 56 schools, we got the administrative records of the school. This is surely an undercount of how much peer conflict is going on, but this is the proportion of, or this is the average number of reports of getting dragged into the vice principal or the principal's office for peer conflicts at the end of the year. And you see the red line are the controlled schools where we didn't have an intervention. And the black line shows a decrease in the rate of bullying and harassment as you go higher in the number of social reference who are part of that group. So remember I told you we did a sort of random selection of students at each school. And so there were just more social reference belonging to that group in some schools versus others. And where they were much more represented, that's where you really see the statistical difference in terms of a reduction in actual behavior at the school. Okay, so time permitting, I have one more example of a different way in which we've been trying to apply some of these lessons about who we pay attention to, how it changes our norms, and whether we can change meaningful behavior with those norms. And now I want to switch to a different context, and I want to talk about a different kind of violence, domestic violence. And I'm going to talk about Uganda, domestic violence in Uganda. I don't want to talk about it in Uganda because it's Uganda is such an outlier in terms of intimate partner violence, but rather we were there because there was a group of really fascinating people who were willing to think out of the box about how to reduce intimate partner violence. And they want a psychological perspective to try to update some of the interventions that have been used. Interestingly, a lot of, I don't know if anyone here studies domestic or intimate partner violence, but a lot of the interventions that are out there right now actually follow a very traditional style of or theory of influence, which is to try to teach people about violence and about its effects, or to use big influences like the threat of punishment, right? And so what we thought was, well, we'd like to think about influence in a different way. And we'd like to think about how people come to their understanding of what is acceptable, whether it's acceptable to use violence or not. And in Uganda, a very big influence over perceptions of acceptability is the Christian church. And in particular, what we know about so many of these communities is that pastors and priests, so there's also a very significant representation of Catholics in the country, go to their faith leader as a way to manage conflict in their intimate partnerships. And so these people are the ones who are often directly influencing how people think about what's acceptable or not in the relationship. This is one of my favorite studies that I've done recently, so I'm really happy to talk about it. One of the reasons why it's my favorite is that this is an immensely interdisciplinary team that I was working on. And one of the members of the team is a human-centered designer. And she took us through a process in which we decided that we would try to influence faith leaders and how they changed people's norms of violence by asking them to use a different syllabus in their premarital counseling. So if you want to know how many Christian churches are funded in East and Central Africa, but also many other places in the world, the number one source of revenue is premarital counseling.
Whoa.
Do you know what the number two source of revenue is? Weddings. So this is the business, right? And if you want to roll messaging about what's acceptable in a relationship, this is a business that's going to keep going, you know. And so we thought, well, let's go where the momentum is. And so what our team did was we actually met with many pastors and priests. And we gave them lots of different messages about how to reduce violence and asked them, can you sort of like the classic Q sort in social psychology? Each message was represented on a card and they were asked, can you sort these cards into piles and can you show us messages that you recognize as having some kind of connection with the Bible? Could you talk about any of these messages and justify them with biblical passages? And so they did that. And what we did was, in collaboration with all of these Ugandan faith leaders and feminist theologians in Africa, was to come up with a new syllabus for premarital counseling that taught couples skills for calming down and refraining from violence. So many of these exercises kind of look a little bit like cognitive behavioral therapy, about slowing down and having better communication and more relaxation to try to prevent fights. And the couples who signed up for premarital counseling that year in about 200 different communities across Uganda were randomized either to this new version of the premarital counseling or to a wait list. And so we had many couples to track to test the efficacy of this premarital counseling. So we had 4 pre-specified outcomes. I can talk in the Q&A if you're interested about how we measured this. We only asked women about violence in their relationship. We did not ask men. And what we see is that 6 months after the conclusion of the premarital counseling, there's a reduction in violence, but it's not significant. It was reduced, though, the incident was reduced in comparing the wait list and the treated couples by 5 percentage points a year afterward. And we also saw an increase in control and decision-making on the part of women. And this is something that both men and women agreed on. So we asked both men and women in the partnership about control, who has control and decision-making. We saw an increase in sexual consent that wasn't significant, and a significant increase in their reports about how they communicated with each other and how they resolved conflict. Okay, so I want to end here and see if there's any opportunity for us to talk. But what I hope I've made a case for here is that we are absolutely and meaningfully influenced by these very big, powerful sources, institutions like courts, propaganda, celebrities, these major events in our societies. But it's the everyday people who are going to help us make sense of what these events mean, of what these powerful, these sources of power mean. And what I want to ask as a social psychologist is, who are people paying attention to when they're doing this sense making? Where are they looking after something happens? Who's helping them to make sense of this? They have a special kind of influence over us. They tell us what others in our community believe. And this matters because I think it really does guide our behavior in terms of what we do in these communities. So I'm going to end there, and I welcome any feedback and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. What drives the transition of an influencer like the radio show host to go from being a radio show host to one that is spewing hateful rhetoric? And then what separates that influencer that kind of joins that wave of hate within that country from the Supreme Court that doesn't join the masses? Yeah, there we go.
Can you say a little bit more about your second question? So what is it that separates a radio propagandist from the Supreme Court in which way?
So I guess the differentiation that I had in my mind was that we have, in the example of the Hutu radio show host, an influencer that joined a popular wave of collective action, but that did not occur with American Supreme Court justice that didn't join the same popular thing.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. So actually, to clarify, the propagandists who were running this radio program were actually linked with the Hutu extremists who were in charge. And so they were essentially an arm of the extremist government that took over during the genocide. And so that was very much a top-down influence. They were very much attempting to just directly influence people. What I want to argue, though, is that what gave them their power is that they already had this huge base of supporters and such an enormous fan base because of the way they had been entertaining people in the years prior to the execution of the genocide, which was meticulously planned by people at the top. And so I think one thing that separates that from the Supreme Court, well, first of all, the fan base of the Supreme Court has really gone down. One thing that we see, we've been measuring, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the same studies, and it is just a beautiful example of polarization in our country. So self-identified Republicans saying that they support the Supreme Court by, sometimes 7 to 8 percentage points more. It's unimaginable rises in support. And then you see like the mirror image of this going down in self-identified Democrats. In those studies, the only thing that people agree on are the norms, actually. Everything else looks very much near polarized in terms of people's approval of the Supreme Court itself, approval of their decisions. And the only thing they seem to agree on is how the public are reacting.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. I had a quick question. So I think in your story so far, it seems like the picture of the media is a bit kind of seen as a neutral representation of the population, right? Like the Supreme Court judgment comes out, suddenly we see all these pictures of protests and maybe come away with like a more accurate depiction of the support for abortion rights, right? But I think there's a case to be made that a lot of times media representation focus on loud minorities, right? For example, if you think about immigration, I think Americans in general are much more supportive of immigration than you would think if you see which voices are represented in media. So I was just wondering, like when it comes to trying to study or disentangle the influence of like perceived and actual norms, do you think there's a way to disentangle the influence of the media in like even a perception of a certain consensus or norm that there is versus what people actually think? Right. And do you think we'd be better served by like a media that is like a more, I don't know, like is the answer that we need a media that more democratically represents the opinions of the people and less the loud minority? Like, what do you think in that direction?
No, I disagree entirely. We get it wrong all the time. We get it wrong all the time. Like that's what's so fascinating to me about norm perceptions, right? A loud minority can, overwhelm. I haven't lost all hope though. I don't think that, I think that when all of the media is getting it wrong, right, that can really change our perceptions. I think people look to understand what the consensus is in various ways. What you're seeing here, we're studying these huge court cases on purpose, right? Because the media can hardly give us a wholly inaccurate perception of how the public are reacting when you're seeing major protests all over the country, right? So, you know, even Fox News was covering the Dobbs protests. But yeah, I think that that's what's so interesting about norms is how often we get it wrong, and propagandists have, you know, grasped this, you know, from the beginning of time, that, you know, if you put, you know, repeated images of what the public are doing in front of people, they'll get it wrong. And it leads to all of these really interesting studies of tipping points in public opinion, where everyone thinks that everyone supports the Shah, and then suddenly, you know, you realize, wait, no one supports the Shah, and you know, and revolution happens. So, yes, this is how media, you know, works against us as well. But I agree. Yeah.
I was fascinating talk. I'm intrigued by your finding with regard to the students, right? That it's, you know, you didn't see a significant, you know, increase if it's just looked at the random sample, but only at the influencers, you want to call it. So I'm curious about what it is about those people. Is it that simply they're getting attention, so therefore it's sort of a cognitive, you're paying attention, or is it something about who they are? I mean, of course, that's a little bit redundant because what makes them get attention, but what do you know about that?
Yeah, it was really great. It was one of my favorite questions. One way I'll answer this is by way of a second study we did. In that large study that I showed you, we actually asked teachers across all 56 schools to try to predict who the influential students would be. Do you want to guess what percentage of students they guessed correctly? Do you have an intuition about?
30%.
We were really close. They only got 20% of them.
Whoa.
They really had the wrong intuition about who these students were. And it was really interesting because we had so much data on these students, we could sort of try to profile who, what kind of student teachers were picking out. Teachers were very likely to pick out students who said that they enjoy reading books, students who had older siblings, students who did a lot of extracurricular activities. What I think that teachers were looking for, the latent variable there is, teachers predicted that students would be influential because they were really good at interacting with teachers. And it was convincing me, you know. So actually a lot of the students who were referenced were behaving badly. Not all of them, but you know, that was another interesting exercise. You would get a list of students who other students were paying attention to, and we always had to get permission from the school to then go get permission from the parents, say, when they participate. And these principals would go down the list and say, okay, all right, oh, not on your life. No, absolutely not. This person can't, you know, why would you have this person participate in, you know, an anti-bullying campaign? I mean, kind of, that's why. So, for sure they were charismatic students. They were charismatic in really different ways. I think we wouldn't always see it, and they were charismatic with very different audiences at the school. Which we did on purpose. We tried to actually, this is actually mathematically constrained. We tried not to choose social reference who were connected to one another, so that like made them more spread out across the social network, and that was by design. So another thing that we did was we actually completely reconstructed the social network based on who sat next to who in class. And what was neat there was that we don't see, just for people who we look at all the time because of seating, we don't see the influence flow that way. It really had to be from those students. Yeah.
Great, yeah, great stuff. A couple of questions. Well, going back to the school study, as you were flashing around the networks for the schools, most of them were sort of big blobby,
Yeah.
but a few of them had these very segregated things. So I wonder how well your interventions work in those contexts. And then shifting to the university context and having just moved to UCSB, the norms of student behavior in and around classes are very different from other universities.
Yeah.
And then the question is, what kind of intervention is going to work in a context where the students aren't all going around, you know, it's much less intense kind of network than you have in a high school, say, right? So what do we do about use of ChatGPT or other forms of cheating, or even just attendance of class, which is there are different roles.
I really agree. Great questions. Does anyone have predictions about what created those clusters in the
Race.
Gender.
gender? It's actually grade.
Ah.
It's something that I just completely forgot. That, well, I didn't forget there were grades, but I remember when I first started working in schools as a graduate student doing research there. And just trying to get a fifth grader to sit next to a seventh grader, you would think they were about to be eaten, so it's a little bit like UCSB in the sense that like you really have to make sure to address these different wings of a school community because they really self-regulate within themselves. There's a lot of examples coming down from the higher grades, and teachers had fabulous intuitions about this. Like there were some middle schools in New Jersey that actually went all the way from K to 8, and the teachers said that they would try to get some of the grades to interact if they had like a particularly good class because they felt the influence would flow down. But I think that, in a school that is so bounded in terms of its community, these kinds of grassroots norms, diffusion efforts can work well. In a place that is not as bounded and where students are interacting in much more maybe balkanized ways, then I think that more top-down norm setting, like having teachers and faculty agree on a certain set of norms about how to run their classroom or what to expect, would be something that I would suggest. I would never suggest not doing the top-down version as well, but what was interesting to me was that students can set the terms of the climate so powerfully, even without, we didn't touch the teachers in these experiments. But I think at a place like UCSB, more faculty norm setting would be useful. It's my favorite toy example of how to explain norms, by the way, is different academic settings and how norms are set in different academic settings, because you can think about how it's not just the people, but it's also the physical environment and so forth. Yeah.
Really interesting talk. So I take it that it's easier to change people's beliefs about what other people believe than it is to change their beliefs themselves. But nevertheless, you also see that the beliefs themselves change. So both, say, gay marriage legalization of marijuana,
Yes.
the one happened and then the other. I wonder if you could speak to how once people appreciate that once you change people's beliefs about what other people think, how that then maybe gradually influences their own beliefs.
Yeah, I wish I had the data. I think we were just talking about that earlier in one of my meetings, that I never hang around quite long enough to get to belief change. I haven't observed that in my studies. And I do think it is a longer term process. But I think that, some of the great work in social psychology that's been done on norms has shown that it's almost psychometrically impossible to disentangle personal beliefs from norms when the norms are so strongly accepted. And one example of this is anti-fat bias, actually. You really cannot distinguish people's personal beliefs from their beliefs about what other people think. It's just so universally accepted. So I have to think that this suggests that there is a process by which you come to see it as so normalized, so in the water, that it just feels wrong to have a different opinion, and you start to think about this as an epistemic kind of exercise where, like, well, I'm learning what's right and what's wrong. But unfortunately I don't have the data to show you that. It's something that maybe fortunately it is a slower process, because if we do have these kinds of propagandists, hopefully they don't change our personal values that